evening and welcome on a old and nasty night out. One of our guest speakers, Governor Weld, is on a conference call, so he will be arriving at or around 6:30 in order to do his presentation and Q&A. I want to note that we have a table set up outside, and on that table are some materials about the spring semester offering of this course, which will focus on climate change and resilience. And I think the schedule that you put out there has a week by week on it. Oh, okay. So the spring semester starts really in the second week of January. And I remind everyone that when we entered into this class, we joked somewhat that we would have to check the news feeds before every one of our classes in order to keep the class up to date. And today, of all days, really underlines that. So I'm going to turn the mic over, and we're going to watch a little bit of video from earlier today as preparation for our discussion of foreign affairs and how they may be shaping the primaries. So.
Thank you, Ted. So we're going to show a brief clip of the impeachment highlights today, which was a pretty dramatic day. And then we're going to have a conversation with Professor Kostas Panagopoulos, who is the chairman of the Political Science Department here at Northeastern, a long-time student of the primaries and of elections, and he's going to talk about kind of impeachment and where things stand. And then we'll be joined by Governor Weld, and Kostas will be interviewing him in front of us, talking about foreign affairs, impeachment, the Republican Party, and then we'll open up for questions. This is, we will not be meeting next Wednesday for Thanksgiving. Ted Landsmark has graciously invited all of you to come to his house for Thanksgiving. And our last meeting will be on December 3rd, Wednesday, where we'll be kind of looking at what the pundits think is going to happen going forward. But for today, for tonight, let's start out with a 5-minute recap of the impeachment testimony. Okay, so with that, I want to invite up Professor Kostas Panagopoulos. He's the chair of the Northeastern Political Science Department to join us. And Kostas has written extensively and studied the primary process, elections. He's quoted often, kind of trying to analyze what's going on. And I guess I wanted to start out by kind of asking you, does this change anything? Are we living in a different world than we were 24 hours ago politically?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to join you and to thank everyone for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to be back at Open Classroom and to be talking politics. And you know, as I reflect on today's developments and developments over the past couple of days, I think even if there was not necessarily a dramatic shift after today's testimony, I think we're starting to see the gradual evolution of something that might eventually become a shift, right? We're seeing a narrative continue to build momentum and to today directly implicate the president. I think that this puts the White House on the defensive, and the president is not necessarily at his best when he is on the defensive and could potentially shoot himself in the foot, depending on how he responds to today's developments. But I also think that there was a great deal of detail in today's testimony by Sondland that it's going to be very, very difficult for the White House to respond to and address given previous statements and other things that others have said. And so I think this was very damaging. And while I think that it may not have necessarily shaken any of the Republicans from their partisan footholds at the moment, it certainly sets the stage for that type of movement if things keep going in this direction and if things are getting harder and harder for the president to respond to in any credible way.
And even I think Pete Buttigieg has floated this idea that, it would be better to decide this at the ballot box, that in some ways this just solidifies Trump's base, it maybe muddies the waters, it could overshadow the Democratic primary. I guess there are two questions. One's, you've worked on the Hill, so you know about kind of the ways of Washington. Was this important to do for constitutional reasons? Was it important to do for political reasons? Or are the Democrats in the country going to look back at this and say, it was a mistake, we just should have gone to the ballot box and decided it there?
Well, the Constitution says that when a president commits certain acts, including high crimes and misdemeanors and bribery and treason, it is incumbent on the Congress to impeach that president, potentially remove that president. It doesn't say only if there's not an election coming up in a few months. So I think the Democrats would have really lost the moral high ground if they truly, genuinely believed there was wrongdoing on the part of this president and they failed to do what they could to hold him accountable. The Republicans might not be willing to do that, mainly for political reasons, but I think that the Democrats were in a tough spot. Politically, it may not make sense to do this, although I'm not so sure about that either. But morally, ethically, legally, constitutionally, I think the Democrats' hands were tied as soon as it became clear that there was evidence of wrongdoing. Now, that was somewhat ambiguous in the Mueller report, although there was certainly enough to have proceeded in that respect, in that direction with respect to obstruction of justice. But it was there was not enough there for the Democrats to have decided to move in the impeachment direction at that point. They may have eventually done so. But in this particular instance, there seemed to be so much evidence pointing in a single direction and so much urgency around it, right? The whistleblower and the determination of the Inspector General, et cetera. It was very, very clear that they needed to step in and do something and to address this, to address wrongdoing. And I think that even if they ultimately do impeach the president, even if he's not removed by the Senate, none of those things are foregone conclusions, I would say at this point. But I think they'll be able to justify what they did to the American people and certainly to the base and to their supporters to say we did what we needed to do to hold this president accountable. And they may even get points for doing what was right at the risk of shooting themselves in the foot politically in 2020.
What about the Republicans? How do they come out of this? I mean, you said there might still be room to move and things might change, but how do you personally grade the Republicans on this? How do you think the voters and history will?
Well, I think it's getting harder and harder for the Republicans to keep defending this president's actions. He's making it very difficult for them. But at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that over 80% of the Republican electorate continues to support this president, that he's got steadfast support with a certain core constituency in the electorate at large that's roughly 35 to 40%. That's not really shaking. And it's even stronger in some of these states and in some of these districts across the country where the president has performed very strongly. So, I think, as I said, it might get harder and harder for the Republicans to continue to support him. But at the same time, they can't overlook some of this evidence that's coming forth. And at some point, they're going to have to ask themselves, not only what is the right thing to do, but also potentially whether or not Donald Trump, depending on how things unfold, is a liability going into 2020, whether he does not necessarily represent a huge threat to them in their states and their districts if he turns on them. So if his credibility is eroded further, and if he does not continue, if the president does not continue to have the kind of sway that he once had in being a credible threat to many of these Republicans, they may just throw him under the bus. And we're seeing evidence of that. We've been seeing it in special elections since 2016. We saw it in 2018. We just recently saw it in places like Alabama and even Louisiana. And at some point, the Republicans have to ask themselves whether or not this president is really as much of a threat to them as they think he is, and if they have to prop him up in such a way that damages the party's long-term viability and credibility moving forward. This can potentially have long-term consequences if the Republicans appear to be turning a blind eye to egregious offenses and violations of constitutional norms.
So there's also a Democratic debate at 9 o'clock tonight.
We promised to have everyone out in time to watch that.
Looking at the Democratic field, kind of what's your evaluation of where things stand now for the Democrats, not just in the polls, but in terms of surges and so forth? And does impeachment or what's going on with Trump now benefit some candidates on the Democratic side over others?
Well, we're seeing a bit of instability, some front runners coming and going, et cetera, and especially if you look at the statewide polls, which I will point out were less reliable in 2016 and in previous election cycles compared to the national polls as bellwethers of what's likely to happen. I have been surprised by some of the movement by people like Pete Buttigieg, who didn't have much of a national profile, seems to be surging in places like Iowa and even New Hampshire, though I think he'll have a tough time in South Carolina. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that the primary electorates in states across the country tend to be more ideologically extreme. They are, the hardcore bases of the two political parties, and they're going to have the strongest views on impeachment on both the left and the right. So those people who are going to be voting in Democratic primaries are going to be much more likely than the general population and the general Democratic electorate to be pushing for Trump's impeachment. I think that they're going to, and I think that that base, that core in the Democratic Party eventually help to push Democrats and Nancy Pelosi in the direction of moving forward on impeachment. So I think that candidates who are pushing hard to hold the president accountable if in fact there were serious wrongdoing will probably benefit at least to some extent. Now, is that going to be enough to overthrow a front runner with a much stronger national profile like Joe Biden? How much of this discussion about the impeachment, since it deals directly with him, will eat away at his support or raise questions about his own integrity? it has the potential to do that, but it also has the potential to have the opposite effect, which is to strengthen his support in the polls if the public and especially the Democrats start to see him as someone who has been unjustly targeted by the president, and I don't say takes pity on him, but sympathizes with him in such a way that encourages them to support him. So I'm not sure that I'm naming any names here, but I think that's the general observation I'd make.
Well, when you watch the debate tonight, what will you be watching for? Who do you think? I mean, even separate from impeachment, who's poised? What are the challenges? Who are you going to be kind of on your scorecard seeing if they make a move or not?
Well, again, the Democrats, there are still some would say way too many of them, and so they have to take shots at each other in their effort to try to get ahead of the pack. But at the same time, this election is not going to be decided on which Democrat the country likes better. It's going to be decided on whether they like Donald Trump or whether they don't like Donald Trump. And so I think their efforts have to be directed toward Donald Trump and against Donald Trump and not against each other. We've seen that backfire now for Kamala Harris, for Castro, and for other candidates who are taking shots at each other. I think they're trying to differentiate themselves, which they do need to do to some extent. But not at the point of coming across petty or otherwise not team players, right? So I think it's a fine line for the candidates to walk. I think we'll be seeing them walk it again tonight. You can see how palatable this is when you're seeing them on stage trying to balance this delicately. It's not an easy task.
So you and I were in Washington a couple of weeks ago talking to alumni down there and talking to people who we know and kind of put into a corner. I was reflecting some of what we'd heard here earlier in the term and said it felt to me, not from a political point of view, but just analytically, that Warren was kind of the real front runner and was moving ahead. We got a lot of pushback on that, and we were underestimating him. As you say, Buttigieg is surging. How would you grade the field at this point?
Well, as I said that night, I believe, and as I'll say again tonight, if you put a gun to my head, I would still have to say that Biden has the best shot of becoming the nominee and also potentially defeating this president. So, and I think that's partly because of his national stature and the experience that he's had. He does have drawbacks, right? He's not a young, enthusiastic voice. There's a big part of the Democratic constituency that is female, African-American, young people. They seem to be more enthused by some of the other candidates. But at the end of the day, the most important factor for Democrats is going to be electability, I believe. And on the electability measure, he still is the strongest Democrat out there. Now, if things start to change considerably in the polls in the weeks and months ahead, that could potentially shift. But given what we see right now in the polls, I still think he's got the best shot because he scores the highest on the electability measure.
And this is more a historical question, but, we've been talking a lot, and there's a lot of talk in the media, obviously, too, about is this an aberration? Is this a spasm that we're going through? And if a Democrat is elected, we'll go back to quote unquote normal, or would a second Trump term, push ahead certain trends? I mean, are you an optimist or a pessimist? How worried are you about this whole question about the fragility or stability of American democracy and kind of what these impeachment hearings are showing and what we're seeing in other kind of flashes of what Trump has been doing?
Yeah. So I have a great deal of confidence in the American political system. It was designed to weather these types of developments. There have been periods of intense polarization and conflict throughout different points in our history, perhaps even more intense than this one. We've managed to survive. But I do think that some of what's going on can do permanent, long-lasting damage to the American political system. And I worry about people's confidence in politics and in the political system if we continue to erode confidence in our institutions, in the rule of law and other fundamental traditions that we have held dear in this country for, since the beginning. So while I think that I would probably consider myself an optimist in the long term, I do have serious concerns in the short term about the damage that's being done to our institutions and to how the public is responding to that.
Great. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Ted Landsmark, who will introduce Governor Weld.
Actually, I'm going to invite Dan up because Dan did such a spectacular job of introducing Governor Weld to our matriculating students earlier. Yeah.
Let's do you want me to do the short version or the long version? Great. Okay. All right. So, where we could start, I guess. So, Governor Weld is an attorney, and he and Ted Landsmark first met practicing law at a law firm known as Hill and Barlow. But I think for today, what will be interesting about your legal career is what you did in 1974. And hopefully we can hear a little bit about your thoughts being a young lawyer in that working for the House on an impeachment inquiry and what lessons you can draw from there. Governor Weld had senior positions in the Department of Justice. He also served as the United States Attorney here in Massachusetts, and then served as governor. He was elected in 1990 and 1994 before going to serve as ambassador to India. Do I have everything right so far? I was being polite, and I wasn't going to mention Mexico. Okay, and he's had a number of roles since then, in and out of public service. So please join me in welcoming Governor Weld, who is currently running for president in the Republican Party, and hopefully we can hear a lot from him, and that you will have the opportunity to interact with him and ask questions as well. So please join me.
Thank you so much, and it's just a treasure for me to be back here with Ted. We were kind of young together in the day, and it was a turbulent time in Boston. It was the 70s. So, but as mentioned, I'm running against Mr. Trump in the Republican primaries, and my strategy is to win or place well in New Hampshire, which is the first primary, February 11th, first in the nation, very influential. Pat Buchanan almost knocked off George Bush 41 by getting 37% of the vote there, and Gene McCarthy did knock out Lyndon Johnson by getting 41% of the vote there. And I'm going around in the New England states saying, hi, I'm a New England Republican, which means fiscally conservative, socially liberal. And a lot of people say, yeah, me too. That's kind of what I am. And I stated my political philosophy in one sentence in a speech to the Republican National Convention in Houston in 1992, which is, I want the government out of your pocketbook and out of your bedroom. And those are still my thoughts. And I've been a Republican since I was 18 years old. I had more than a dalliance with the Libertarian Party a few years ago, ran as the number 2 guy on their ticket in 2016. But my views have not changed from Republican to Libertarian to Republican. All I can tell you is I'm not a member of that party in Washington, D.C. now that calls itself the Republican Party, because it's a stranger to everything I was brought up with or raised to believe in. I worked for Jack Javits, who was a wonderful senator from New York, in the House, and before I even went to law school. And my big break came when I was sitting in the law library my second year in law school looking bored, and a friend of mine, a Ripon Society friend, which is liberal Republicans, came up and said, "You look bored." I said, "I am." He said, "You should go in and volunteer to do work for Marty Linsky. He's this very smart state rep in Boston in the State House, 29 years old. He's thinking of running for lieutenant governor next year." So I did, and I did good work for Marty. And while everyone else was going to make love, not war rallies on the Boston Common. And I didn't think any more about it. And then 3 years later, I was at Hill and Barlow with Ted 3 or 4 years later, and I got a call from Marty Linsky, who said they're looking for sane Republicans to go down and work on the Nixon impeachment. This was late fall. This was the fall of '73, shortly after the Saturday Night Massacre, where Archie Cox and Elliot Richardson, Ruckelshaus, got broomed out by the President Nixon. And it was still a time when official Washington thought that that was going to go nowhere, that House Judiciary Committee impeachment inquiry. I was advised by several committee chairmen in the House not to take a job there. But I said, what the hell? I went down, and the first day there, it was a Friday, one other young lawyer from Yale Law School, not Harvard, had been hired. Her name was Hillary Rodham. And we walked in, and John Doerr, who was the chief counsel, said, "Bill, Hillary," had kind of a ring, didn't it? But he literally said, "Bill, Hillary, I need a definition of what's grounds for impeachment of a president. And, it's Friday afternoon. I'll give you till Tuesday morning. How's that sound?" We said, "That sounds great." So we nearly went blind in the Library of Congress over the weekend trying to find judicial decisions describing what's grounds for impeachment of a president. Of course, there aren't any. It's a completely political remedy put in the Constitution as such by people at the convention, Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, who knew they had to sell this to the colonies, and you needed 9 out of 13 votes of the colonies to have this puppy adopted as the Constitution of the United States of America. And there were a bunch of people, and I would have been among them had I been there, called the anti-federalists, the anti-Constitution people, who thought that this was too big a cession of power to the federal government. And the problem with the prior system, the Articles of Confederation, which governed us from 1774 to 1787, was it had no executive. It wasn't that it had too strong an executive. It had no executive, so it couldn't really take decisive action. Plus, every colony had their own system of coinage. It wasn't like the euro and a common currency. So it was just not an effective, not a forceful system of government. But the colonists were damn used to not having an executive. And if they knew anything, every man jack of them, as they say, it's that they didn't really care for monarchs, and in particular George III of England. So they didn't want to go back to a monarchy or a king or anybody too strong. And the executive power, which is vested in the President of the United States under Article 2 of the Constitution, it's a pretty powerful position. The President of the United States is fixed term, can't be kicked out like in a parliamentary system for 4 years, and a lot of power under that artfully worded Article 2 of the Constitution. So everybody knew that, and there had to be an argument, don't worry, if these things that the framers were worried about in Philadelphia in 1787 come to pass. And the number one thing they were worried about, say I, who was a co-author of the book, along with Hillary Rodham and a bunch of other people who were smarter than we were, about what constitutes grounds for impeachment and removal of a president. And the number one thing they were worried about was foreign intermeddling in our affairs. The colonies felt very little compared to France and England and the monarchies of Europe, and they really didn't want to be rolled over and crushed. And they were accustomed to having British redcoats billeted in their houses. And where the Second and Third Amendments came from was the redcoats were allowed to keep their rifles, but the colonists in the house were not. They had to give them up because they were afraid they might shoot the redcoat. That didn't go down too well, actually. And everyone knows about the Second Amendment about guns. The Third Amendment, everyone's forgotten about it. It's about no quartering, no billeting of redcoats or anybody else in the colonist houses. So anyway, there was a lot of people who thought that the executive was too strong. The Constitution was very controversial. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, as most of you probably know, wrote a series of papers called the Federalist Papers, arguing for adoption of the Constitution. But there was this nagging issue. The executive was too strong. What are we doing with an executive? We fought the whole revolution to overthrow the monarch from England. We don't like this. This is too much power. So a deal was worked out, and it just barely passed anyway. But a deal was worked out that it could be ratified on condition that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, would come along within a year or two and be ratified. And that was a common and universal understanding. My favorite one of the first 10 amendments is, of course, speaking as a true libertarian, small l, formerly capital L, that the power is not granted to the government, to the federal government, or reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. And that's my go. You know, individual liberties predominate over assertions of government power every time. So in order to sell the Constitution, they put in the removal power so that they could argue, this is not a king. We can remove him. Congress, despite what President Trump says, Congress has oversight and supervisory authority over the operation of the executive branch by the president. Witness Article 2, Section 4, the House has the sole power of impeachment. The Senate has the sole power to try impeachments. It's right there in black and white. And that was a big part of what enabled them to sell this document to the 9 colonies. 9 of the 13 colonies. I guess all 13 came on, but you needed 9 to have it take effect. So I mentioned that just to show that the little known and seldom used impeachment power in the Constitution was not an afterthought. It was absolutely central to the relationship between the powers, the various branches in the Constitution. And, you know, it's a big leap to think in terms of removing a president who has been elected. After all, we have a fixed-term system of government, not a constitutional system where the prime minister can get kicked out on a vote of no confidence on one day's notice. But this was a necessary power that's in there. And the two things that the framers were most concerned about were bribery, intermeddling by foreign powers because of whatever reason in our institutions. I don't think it ever occurred to them that a foreign power might intermeddle in our very elections. And it certainly didn't occur to them that a president of the United States might be so corrupt that he would sell out his own country in the matter of the federal election, which is how he got there in the first place, and the most sensitive and important democratic institution and exercise of democratic powers, i.e. suffrage, of anything we ever do as members of a democratic society. It didn't really occur to them because it was such a heinous thought. Bribery of monarchs was relatively common in the 18th century, and so that was not a stretch for them. But something like what Mr. Trump has done was just never, it was inconceivable. It was so much beyond the pale. The other thing that they were most concerned about was that a lot of discussion about this from Madison, Hamilton, at the convention and in the Federalist Papers. So a person with so much ability and stature that he, in those days it was he, could achieve a position of such power, surely it might cross his mind that he could make himself even richer, even more politically powerful, even benefit members of his family and himself and his own business interests if he were really, really, really thoroughgoing, corrupt, and rotten as it's possible to be. Well, the grounds for impeachment of Mr. Trump and removal don't just fit the bill for what the framers were worried about. They check all the boxes in heavy black ink. And, you know, I was one of 1,000 former prosecutors that signed a letter saying the 10 examples of obstruction of justice detailed in Bob Mueller's report were criminal and indictable, and we would have indicted them. In fact, if I'd had the case instead of Bob Mueller, I would have indicted the president in a heartbeat and just sealed the indictment to meet the objection that it would keep him away from his day job. But so we all said this is the most clear and convincing evidence of obstruction of justice that we've ever seen. And some of us, myself included, thought that if I had the case, I not only would have indicted the guy, I would have moved that he be held without bail, because the evidence was so strong, so convincing, so clear, that certainty of conviction, which can be a factor in bail hearings, is a factor in favor of pretrial detention. I know it's just a intellectual argument in context, but the evidence was that strong. So that's an article. Ukraine is an article. It's got both corruption of office and inviting foreign intermeddling. Obstruction of Congress is an article. Mr. Nixon was Article 3 of the Nixon impeachment was obstruction by not willingly and eagerly complying with the subpoenas, and Mr. Trump takes a somewhat more radical position that Congress has no right to investigate him whatsoever, which is plainly sideways with the Constitution. So that's what I picked up in my wanderings on impeachment. I picked up a lot of other stuff too, and there's things I'd like to do if I get to Washington. And I'd love to talk about foreign policy and the international arena and climate change, and I'm sure there's general interest here. So let me stop there and invite questions from this learned group. That's where I usually learn more than when I'm expatiating. Thank you.
So thank you, Governor Weld. We're really glad to have you with us tonight. We appreciate your opening remarks and eager to hear more from you. We'll get to the audience in a second. Maybe I'll kick things off by asking you to comment a little bit in greater detail about the strategy moving forward for your presidential campaign. I think it's probably wise to think about New Hampshire, given you're from neighboring Massachusetts and the important role that New Hampshire plays. At the same time, if we're going to be realistic and if we still believe in polls, you've got an uphill battle, even in New Hampshire. So I'm wondering what your sense is, or how you look at this as a candidate, how you think, you know, what you're hearing from voters on the ground, and how that's squaring with the polling and other evidence that you see, and how you think you can get to the finish line to make enough of a dent to damage this president.
Well, and a related question: you've done this before. Why did you decide to get back into this fray, particularly given that you're running against the sitting president of your own party, or at least?
Well, he's titularly of my own party, but not really. I mean, I think this Republican Party, like the Whigs in the 1850s, is going to split in half unless they do the right thing and remove the president. And the wonderful thing about the split up of the Whigs is there's good guys and bad guys. The pro-slavery Southern wing, called the Know Nothing Party, were characterized by violent anti-immigrant fervor. It was Catholics at that point, not Hispanics or Muslims coming in from Ireland and Italy and Germany, and conspiracy theories and violent rallies. I mean, it was the Trump Party. And they spun out of, they just disappeared. And the other wing, the nice people, pro-union, anti-slavery of the North, they joined John C. Fremont and the Free Soil Party in 1856, but in the next cycle they elected Abraham Lincoln president of the United States. And I think that'll happen. If the Republicans in the Senate duck their duty, and they have a duty under the Constitution, I believe, based on the evidence that I checked off, and you never know what you're going to find in a big white-collar investigation. I've presided over hundreds of them, 5 years as U.S. Attorney and 2 years as head of the Criminal Division in Washington. And sometimes, you know, the third person that goes in the grand jury comes up with something and you say, whoa, we were going to indict this case even before we knew that? Whoa! So you could see something like that happen. And in terms of the path forward, you know, I think that a win or a strong place in New Hampshire is a very good start. Then I've got Super Tuesday on March 3rd, which includes Vermont, where Democrats don't even have to re-register to vote in the primary, and Massachusetts and Wisconsin, all of which are crossover states. There are 24 states that have so-called open primaries or crossover states and permit members of one party to vote in the primary or the other. So in a nutshell, my strategy is not to suppress voting, as the Republicans in Washington seem to like to do, particularly in areas with anything like a substantial minority population, but to enlarge the electorate that's going to vote in the Republican primary. And the reason you see these polls that Trump is, 98-2 popular among Republicans is they're basically polling the Republican State Committee and its hangers-on, who are the Trump organization in every single state. And Trump has put his own people in every single Republican state party. And if in polling, you can poll either with an open screen or a very tight screen. And if you poll with a very tight screen, it's do you love the Republican State Party and have you voted in the last 6 Republican primary elections? You're not going to get too many Weld voters out of that. I would always, in this state, my own state, I would fight the Republican vote to a bloody draw and then go into the primary at large, and we permit independents to vote for either Republicans or Democrats, and the independents would come in 6-1 for me. And that's how I got to 71% on my re-elect, having been elected with only 50.01% of the vote. They liked what they saw from Weld Cellucci reaching across the aisle, centrist, taking care of everybody, African American Commission, Hispanic American Commission, outreach to make sure every group felt represented and at the table, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the strategy is to emphasize the 24 states that allow crossover voting, and to come out of Super Tuesday having won not one state, but more like 4 or 5 states. California has moved up to Super Tuesday this year, and that's not a crossover state. On the other hand, I've spent a lot of time out there. I was Pete Wilson's national finance chairman, very good friends with Arnold Schwarzenegger, know a lot of people who have been in the legislature out there. And let's face it, Trump and California don't even speak the same language. So that antipathy may even cross over into the Republican primary. That's more of a wild card. Yeah. But that's the strategy. Start strong, and you never know what's going to happen in Washington to make the unthinkable become the inevitable in one day. It happened in the Nixon impeachment. Everyone said, no, there's not enough evidence. And Nixon looked like he was going to beat the damn thing until the Supreme Court says the president is not above the law, hand over the tapes. Nixon, say whatever else you will, he had a sense of shame, he had a sense of history, and he handed over the tapes. And he was gone. Barry Goldwater went to the White House the next day with the Republican leaders from the Senate and House and said, you're out of here. You have no support in the Senate. And Nixon practically asked for the pen. Well, that's the sort of thing that could happen if we had people like Barry Goldwater in the Senate right now.
Does it surprise you that more than 8 in 10 Republicans still approve this president in polls consistently over the course of his presidency?
Yes, yeah, it does. It does. I would have thought that the acting out in the White House and the perfectly atrocious personal behavior and vicious attacks on individuals, the poor Muslim woman whose son was killed in the Middle East fighting for the United States. The president takes off after her like a rocket. What is her problem? She's a Muslim, They must be muzzling her because of her religion. Did I mention she was a Muslim? Something's wrong there. I don't know what her problem is. Her problem is her son is dead, and the President of the United States is attacking her personally for not having chirped up and said something when he thought she should have, so that he can accuse her of having been muzzled. I mean, his real target there was the Muslim religion. There wasn't anything else.
Can we go ahead and open it up to the audience and get your thoughts? Great. Okay.
Governor, what do you think would happen if Donald Trump were to leave office prematurely? What would that do to the Republican race, and where would you fit in if that were to happen?
Well, I think there would be a huge sigh of relief from a lot of people. And let's say it happens a day after Super Tuesday, I would become the only guy standing because too many state ballot access deadlines would have passed. So that would be very interesting. Joe Walsh from Ohio, former congressman, is also still in the race. Mark Sanford has left. But, no one else is going to get in the next couple of weeks. I'm spending $25,000 every couple of days to join some big state primary, and they make you cross their palm with silver to get on the ballot. And plus, in addition to which, there are legal deadlines for filing. And people think, oh, well, if Trump goes, then Mike Pence becomes the nominee. No, he becomes acting president, but he does not become a nominee because you have to have delegates to become the nominee, and he would have missed all the deadlines. Now, I've got some Republican friends in Washington. Haley Barbour and I have done a lot of business. Newt Gingrich and I have done a lot of business. Karl Rove and I have done a ton of business. Larry Kudlow and I are from the same cloth economically. I'm not a rabid Democrat in the views of many people in Washington, D.C. I've raised tons of money over the years for Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn. And when Haley was the head of the national committee, he would come to me. I was a new governor. He'd say, Governor, we have a problem here. All our big donors to the Republican National Committee are pro-choice. So we have to talk to them 2 hours before we even get to the ask. And you're such a damn social liberal, you can talk to these donors and you don't have to dribble around the court for 2 hours. You can go right for the hoop. And I was happy to do it. But there's some goodwill there too. Having said all that, my friends, the goodwill, etc., I'm sure there are people in the Republican National Committee who are kind of dug in. Maybe they're more evangelical type or always Trumpers and just don't like the cut of my jib. So I think you would see a colossal war around the convention with a lot of other people popping up, changes of rules retroactively, favorite sons and daughters. What about Nikki Haley? What about this? What about that? But in terms of a Ted Cruz or a Marco Rubio getting in even one day after Super Tuesday and saying, I want to join Weld as an active candidate in the primaries, it's too late. So that's a prospect that actually doesn't cause me any discomfort.
So, two related questions. Actually, you almost answered already one of them. But I was just.
Well, that's good because I don't think I could remember more than two.
I was just talking to somebody from the Midwest who said, I go out in Michigan, Eastern Michigan, whatever, and the people there hate Trump, but they wouldn't think of voting for anybody else because he's delivering on what they want. In this case, pro-life. And I'd like to understand from your point of view, is that a real issue? I mean, it looks like it to me. In other words, it doesn't mean that the people that are the 80% that you referred to like him in any way whatsoever. Maybe 20% do. But I want to understand, do you think that that's a fair assessment? And a related question, which you asked was, which you even mentioned, I'm worried about Nikki Haley, actually. I could see very well, if there's impeachment, if it goes forward, he's removed, Pence coming up, and the Congress taking Nikki Haley as the vice presidential candidate. Obviously, this is what she's playing for. So I'd like to know your opinion. I don't know if you're willing to state in public.
Well, no, I think he might very well shove out Mr. Pence and put in Nikki Haley. He'd be dumb if he didn't, frankly. Were you asking earlier if I think pro-life is going to be a big issue? Yeah, the Republican Party is more than half pro-life, and most of the people in Washington are very much pro-life. The New Hampshire Republican Party is 65% pro-choice. The country as a whole is pretty close to 50-50. In my day, it was 60-40 pro-choice, and I think it's closer to 50-50 now. So is that an issue? Yeah. But, I mean, I was known as totally pro-choice, Mr. Planned Parenthood, and 1/3 of my vote came from pro-lifers because, I wouldn't call them anti-choicers, and I wouldn't go rub their nose in anything or say that they were wrong, and just say, I think this is a matter of personal liberties and self-regarding conduct, and it shouldn't be up to the congressman to tell you whether or not you're going to have a child. And these new statutes really give the pro-life position a bad name. They give superior rights to rapists as opposed to rape victims. And they say, perhaps not everybody knows this, this is a couple of statutes in the South, a couple in the Midwest, full support of the Trump machine all the way. And they say if a woman is raped, she has to bear the rapist's child to term, no matter what. If any doctor interferes, performs an abortion, he gets 99 years in prison. The rapist doesn't get anything as a result of this. So let's say she's a married woman, she and her husband would like to have their own child. No, they're out of luck. They got to bring the rapist child to term and then presumably raise the rapist child, or face, I don't know, collection efforts from the rapist. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. It's not back to the vintage of Carrie Nation. It's back to the vintage of the Stone Age and the chattel theory of women. So I talk about that. I don't care if anybody wants to hide from those facts, but those are real facts, and I talk about that in my efforts to persuade more women, not just suburban moderate women, to stand up and be counted. So yeah, I think it's a big issue, and I'm going to be bigly in the debate.
I apologize. I also have two questions that are somewhat unrelated. But first, I'm curious, given Donald Trump's position on immigration, the wall rhetoric, what position are you going to give as an alternative and policies you would put in place? And also, I'm curious, if you were to win the Republican nomination, what candidate on the Democratic side would you not like to go up against?
Well, I'm taking the second question first. I'd love to go up against any of the Democrats. I see them all the time. I get a big kick out of Mayor Pete. I've known Joe Biden for 2.5, 3 decades. I think he's a great guy. I like them all. If you're talking about who I like to go up against in order to maximize my chances of winning the election, Elizabeth Warren in a heartbeat. And I know Senator Warren. We're both Harvard Law babies. And she's a wonderful, warm person. Actually, I think she may have even voted for me one time. She used to be a Republican by her own account. Maybe that was only in Oklahoma. But so I like her a lot. But there's 2 worms in the apple there. One worm is no jobs are ever created by the private sector. They're all created by the government. Small business doesn't create any jobs. She went to a small business annual awards convention, and the grand prize winner had built a plant next door. She said, I want to congratulate you on the award, Harry, but I certainly hope you don't think you created any of those jobs, because they were actually all created by the government, because if it hadn't been for the roads that the government built, private sector didn't build, well, no one would have been able to drive to work, so you wouldn't have any employees there. And if it hadn't been for universal, compulsory, free K-12 education, nobody, when they got there, would have a thing in their head, so they wouldn't be any use to you, even if they could have walked to work, okay? You can't take that position and be elected President of the United States in the United States of America. We're a slightly right-of-center country. Not much, but slightly right-of-center, and that just won't fly. And I don't think, having been a 2-term governor, I don't think that 80% of the jobs are created by small business. I know, and I just think too many people know that. So that's worm number 1. Worm number 2 is some of the tax stuff. I read with great amusement the list of all the tax changes to fund Medicare for all and a couple of other things. And we're going to tax capital gains at the same rate as ordinary income. Why not? Well, yeah, no good reason unless you want to stimulate capital formation, which is supposed to be a pretty good objective in a capitalist country. We're going to have a 2% wealth tax, not an income tax, a wealth tax on the richest Americans. And people say, they're so rich, $50 million, what's 2% to them? Well, I've read the debates on the adoption of the progressive income tax in Congress in 1913. It was at 0.5% on income. And the people on the other side said, if Congress can constitutionally properly pass a tax of 0.5% on income, what's to prevent some future Congress of imposing a tax of 1% or even 2%? And the proponents said, with great Jesuitical aplomb, ridiculous. The possibility of abuse of a power is not a sufficient argument against its existence, and that argument carried the day. Well, a few decades later, I took economics. The marginal rate was 91%. John Kennedy was president. So that 2% is not going to stay at 2%. So I think that's the other worm. But I like her a lot. I like her a lot. There's not a single one of them that I don't like. I admire Bernie Sanders, but so many of the positions there are single dollar figure. Senator Sanders' position on climate change is, I'm going to spend $16.3 trillion to defeat climate change. And no one else has yet, met that ante. So he's the leader in the clubhouse on the person who's doing, quote, most about climate change. But more about climate change later.
I'm shocked that worm number 2 was not Medicare for all. Is that worm number 3 for Elizabeth Warren?
Yeah, it could be. I'm lumping Medicare for all and the fantastical Green New Deal into one.
Immigration.
Oh yeah, immigration. I think we need a lot more work visas, not a lot fewer. The whole thing about how there are these illegal aliens, 11 million of them, that all want to be citizens, and they just crawl through the mud over the Mexican border. It's a complete canard. It's a dog whistle. It's just something designed to get everybody all hot and bothered and think I stood in line and they're not staying in line. Most of the people who are on that list have just overstayed their visas, and they didn't just come across the Mexican border. So it's just a straw man for political purposes for the president. And boy, he's done everything with immigration for political purposes and trying to stir up resentment among anybody who loses a job for any reason whatsoever, that this brown person coming across the Mexican border took away their job and probably is going to harass their wife very soon. It's just the most poisonous and transparent politics I've ever seen. That entire campaign of 2016 was one great big dog whistle. Black Lives Matter was a live topic in those days, and we would give rallies. And we'd always be picketed. I would always be picketed in particular, and there would be Trump guys wearing red shirts up in the bleachers, and someone would say, "Do Black Lives Matter?" And they would say, "All lives matter, all lives matter." And it was just it's code for no, Black lives don't matter. So I would say, well, actually, that's not a good answer. That's just a dog whistle. And the correct answer to the question, "Do Black Lives Matter?" is not all lives matter, howbeit soever that may be true. It is yes, and at which point the Trump people go crazy and say, you just don't know what you're talking about. So I'm sorry, I'm answering about immigration. So we need a lot more visas. We could not populate the construction or agricultural industries in the West or tourism in the Northeast if we didn't have immigrant labor coming in. And any governor in the United States will tell you that, because we're familiar with the workforce in our various states. And the business community, by and large, understands we need more EB-5 visas, more HB-1, more H-2B visas every year. They run out in January every single year. So it's purely a cynical political play by the president to have a one-word platform for immigration, namely wall. But we don't need a wall even to have a secure southern border. We need more judges to hear the refugee and asylum cases, so we're not ripping kids out of their mother's arms and putting them in cages. We need more drones to catch the coyotes who prey on people who are coming across the border. And we need more people down there. We don't need a wall or two huge walls with a moat between and alligators swimming in there to eat the people who are trying to come across the border. I mean, I've often called him a one-man crime wave. He's also a one-man Saturday Night Live in terms of thinking up stuff that's just so ridiculous and doubling down and tripling down. So I'm proud that we're a nation, a melting pot, a nation of immigrants. My friend Charlie Nesson from Harvard Law School once said in my hearing, and I've never forgotten it, he said, well, you go to the Olympics, and most of the nationalities, you can they look like the nationalities they are. The Italians look like Italians, the Ethiopians look like Ethiopians, but the Americans look like everybody.
Great. Thank you for being here today, Governor. This being a session technically... Oh. Okay, sorry. This being technically foreign policy flashpoints, I have a quick question related to that. In December of 2014, President Obama made history in announcing that he would try to normalize relations as much as possible with the Cuban government. Since then, unfortunately, President Trump has changed that trajectory. However, many academics say that had it been kept on that process of engagement, Cuba would have been in a much more democratic place today. So my question to you is related to Cuba. If you were to gain the presidency, what would you direct your State Department to do in relation to Cuba?
Well, I would immediately totally normalize relations with Cuba and end any sanctions or negative aspects of the relationship whatsoever. I've said since the 1970s that we should have paved the streets of Havana with gold, and it would have saved us a lot of trouble. I'm afraid that swam to the ears of Jesse Helms when he was blocking me to be ambassador to Mexico, because Mexico is one country that does have has had fairly decent relationships with Cuba, including during the total embargo, and he was afraid I would diffuse that poison down there. But there's absolutely no reason for us to have this hostile relationship towards Cuba, and we could achieve a lot in one stroke just by doing what Mr. Obama did.
Thank you very much, Governor. I have two questions. First, is there any chance at all that you're going to face President Trump on the debate stage? Give us some insight into the way the contest is likely to unfold. And then the second question is, assuming the president is impeached, give us some insight as to what Mitch McConnell might do to lay the groundworks for the Senate trial. The two broad alternatives are a 6 to 8 week trial, which would have the advantage of taking the 6 Democratic senators who are running for president off the campaign trail, forcing them to sit and listen as jurors, versus a 2-day trial to kind of put it behind them very quickly.
Well, everyone seems to think that Mitch McConnell makes the rules for the trial in the Senate. He doesn't have anything to do with it. It's the case is tried by the 6 managers appointed by the House. So it's a procedure controlled by the House, subject to, procedural supervision by John Roberts as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, as is specified in the Constitution. But that's just a big canard out there that nobody seems to be focusing on at all. Even Mitch himself has said, we'll have a trial. How long that's going to be is another matter, as though it was his call. It's not his call at all. Well, they're likely to put on their case in the most forceful way they possibly can. I mean, if they're smart, they won't run on forever or they'll lose their audience. And their audience is the American people. And this all comes down to the Republican senators. It is a political remedy. It's not a criminal remedy. There's no prison, there's no criminal aspect to it. So this is pure politics, but I say that in a good sense, not a bad sense, meaning it's not criminal, but it is something that's permitted by the Constitution to redress a political wrong. And I would certainly say the president has committed many, many infamous political wrongs. Some of them, I thought the Ukraine caper was perilously close to the line of treason itself, because Russia is the closest thing we have to a hot war adversary right now, and he's giving aid and comfort to Russia big time across many fronts. So I think it's not possible to predict what Mitch will do, but what I will be encouraging him to do, I'll be saying, well, Leader McConnell, who I've known for years and worked with, is a person who plays a long game and a deep game. Both those things are true, but Mitch loves, I don't think he minds hearing them. I would say, well, I don't know. He also, he's a man of the Senate. He's the leader of his caucus. He bears a fiduciary responsibility toward the caucus so that the Senate is not lost. And if he really wants to know what the senators think individually, he doesn't have to have a public, open ballot. And Senator Flake from Arizona says if it was a secret ballot, 35 senators would vote against the president. I don't know about that number. But there are degrees, gradations of what the leader could do. He could say, well, welcome to the caucus today. I don't know. I was just thinking it might be fun to have a straw poll, just little bitty pieces of paper. You can push them across the table at me. No one else will see them. I just want to get a sense of the mood of the caucus. That sort of thing happens all the time in Washington. And even before you get there, a leader of either chamber is likely, more than likely, to have spoken individually with every single member to see how they're doing. And, if Mitch really wants to know what people think, he'll say, tell me what you really think. And if, 15 or 16 members say, well, I think in the scheme of things, he belongs out of here. He belongs removed. But I'm not going to cast the first stone or I'll never be reelected and I'll be hung from the highest lamppost. If Mitch hears that from 15 or 16 senators, I think he'll go the rest of the way and free everybody to vote their conscience. And then the country will be able to heave a great big sigh of relief because we won't have to worry about the president coming back and ushering in his civil war. He will never agree to debate me. First of all, two reasons. One, he has no knowledge base on any substantive issue whatsoever. Two, I'm not without experience on the debate stage and not without experience in litigation. And when I was U.S. Attorney in Massachusetts, we indicted 111 public corruption cases, which is probably the closest to the tilt against Mr. Trump. And we had convictions either by guilty plea or jury in 110 of the 111 cases.
Hi, I have a foreign policy question. If you were president, what strategy would you adopt in working with our international allies? Would you continue with some of Trump's tactics in approaching trade and foreign security, or would you revert to the norm of working within the frameworks of international organizations?
No, I'd be working within the framework of international organizations. I think Mr. Trump has gone way beyond the pale in insulting our allies, including NATO. As a matter of fact, his actions in the round suggest that he would like to give Vladimir Putin his wish to have the boundaries of Russia return to the boundaries of the former Soviet Union. Everything he does is, particularly in Ukraine as an example, is undermining the security of Eastern Europe, and that's a big deal. And I would go to Belarus and say, don't throw in with Putin, or Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are gone, which probably is true. I am a free trader, unlike Mr. Trump, and I understand that one of the purposes of our having a strong military is to, in a pinch, keep the supply lanes open, the air lanes and the sea lanes for free trade around the world. And allies in that type of enterprise are force multipliers for the United States. And if you have allies in Asia with whom you're on good terms, they can help you to keep those sea lanes open so you don't have to send the Seventh Fleet every single time the Chinese run past the rails or past the guidelines. So I absolutely would work within the established order. I do think we can't roll over and play dead for China. Their position on intellectual property is completely unacceptable. But I kind of agree with what Xi Jinping said before he got in, which is we have 1,000 reasons to be friends. And I think that's right. We have so many touch points with China and so many places where creative deal-making could create a win-win scenario. Mr. Trump, of course, thinks there's no such thing as a win-win scenario because he thinks everything is a zero-sum game, which is just an idiotic way to look at negotiating of any kind. And when I was governor working with the Democrats in the legislature, I had so many 3- and 4-cushion deals that produced much good and left no losers behind. I mean, I might go to, and this is an example of that, what I'm talking about, I might go to China and say, look, you got a lot of sway over North Korea. Maybe you could exercise a little bit of that and calm down your dog there. And I'll go to the South Koreans and I'll say, I don't think the North Koreans, and I don't think the Chinese behind them like all these missiles being pointed at them from 9 miles away, which they are. We had a hard enough time with 90 miles away with Cuba. So maybe you could talk to North Korea and I'll talk to South Korea. And by the way, what do you think in the fullness of time if there were a reunification of the peninsula and none of this strife? Well, I'm guessing, but I think China would like that because North Korea and the missiles, they have to be an irritant for China. They're right there. They're even closer than Cuba is to the United States. But that's just an example of creative deal-making. I don't know whether it would work or not, but I'd be there with bells on to try it on a moment's notice.
Thank you for joining us tonight, Governor Weld. I am glad that my classmate brought up Cuba, and if I could go with the two-question minimum, I'd like to know if you have any thoughts or potential solutions for, one, Guantanamo, and two, the intractable issues in the Middle East, and specifically what Trump is doing gradually in terms of policy with Israel.
So I don't see why we need Guantanamo. I mean, I know they're sensitive assets, but I don't see why it has to be there. It strikes me as an issue that demands political will. But if even Barack Obama blinked on that, there must be stuff on the other side that I don't know about. So that's that one. Point two. Oh yeah. So I don't like what Trump is doing with my old friend Bibi. Bibi is turning into an alt-right guy. And 30 years ago, I used to go pub crawling in Jerusalem with Abe Sofer, who was legal counsel of the State Department, former federal judge, and Bibi Netanyahu, Danny Merodor, Ehud Olmert, all the Likud superstars who were then in their 20s. And they all became prime minister except for Danny Merodor, who came close. But so I knew them all well, and then in later years I got to know Shimon Peres even better. And he's my abiding hero in Israel. He was the man who some people accused of being a dreamer, but he wasn't a dreamer. He's the man who constantly invoked the need for multinational economic development projects as the sinews of peace. He was absolutely right. So, I have a long correspondence and pictures back and forth with both Bibi and Shimon, probably the only American whose two best friends in Israel were Netanyahu and Peres, who were not cut from the same cloth. And it may be my distaste for Mr. Trump's efforts with people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and Erdogan in Turkey that has rubbed off on my old friend Bibi, but I don't know. There was a page one New York Times article about the progression of Netanyahu's thinking that I found troubling, and I do think that, I want a two-state solution. I kind of think it has to come from the Israelis and the Palestinians. But you do need a two-state solution, because a one-state solution, with deep apologies to Bibi and all my Likud and hardline Jewish friends, a one-state solution is a state run by Israel. It doesn't give the Palestinians anything. So I would say to both sides, look, happy to do whatever we can, but it's got to be your idea, and we'll cheerlead for you, but we're not going to get in the middle and say, here's the solution you have to adopt, because it has to work for both of you. I don't think that's really shirking a responsibility, but I'd be interested in other people's views on that.
So my question is something that's not as talked about on the candidate stage. I want to ask about mental health reform. It's not often talked about during debates, and when it comes to mental health coverage and insurance plans, whether that be statewide or nationwide, it's not often addressed, and it's something that affects almost every community, probably within the United States. And I just want to
almost every family,
almost every human being, for that matter, probably. And I just wanted to ask why you think that is, that it's not talked about as often, and any policies that you think should be put into place.
I don't know. I'm on the record saying I would sharply increase funding for mental health, addressing mental health, both prevention and treatment. It's a much bigger problem in terms of numbers of people than is commonly acknowledged. And I'm also very interested in the addiction issue for everything, narcotics, alcohol, tobacco, opioids. And I think all of those should be treated as public health emergencies as opposed to candidates for priority in criminal justice enforcement. As a matter of fact, I've spoken to that effect in speeches at the National Mall. So I'm firmly on record there too, and I think they're cousins as issues. But mentally, the similarity is that mental health gets swept under the rug, and addiction issues often get swept under the rug as well. And we want them out in the sunshine and treated as a national health emergency, just slightly different types.
Governor, first of all, thank you for having the courage 2 different times to speak out against our current president. Back to the Middle East, there's legal and moral issues related to having troops on the ground in the Middle East, and our borders are the whole globe these days. What would your solution be in terms of taking the troops away, if you think that's the right thing to do, yet still keeping a security presence there so we can protect our borders over there?
Well, I remember not so long ago, but maybe a year ago, it was after a talk with John Bolton, the president suddenly took the airwaves and announced that he was sending 5,000 more troops to the Middle East. He didn't say exactly where he was sending them. And I think Bolton must have called him weak or something in the meeting because nothing really came of it. So I don't think he's thought it through there. I'm not a guy who believes in boots on the ground for regime change every time we see something in another country we don't like. I hate to say it, but I think the good part of the impetus for the Iraq invasion in 2003 was that there were things done in that palace, rape rooms, breaking the knees of Iraqi soccer players who the 2 sons of Saddam Hussein didn't think had played hard enough. I mean, it was a palace where anything went, and it was deeply offensive to our number 1 guy at the time. But that's not boots on the ground for regime change. And there's, in Afghanistan and many countries in Africa, there are atrocious policies dealing with treatment of women, females, female genital mutilation, and there are also some matrilineal societies over there, which is quite the opposite. But to think in terms of regime change, because a country not only has atrocious policies towards women, but has had them for 1,500 years, you're just not going to get too far there. It's part of the reason why I'm not really a hawk on Afghanistan. I don't understand why we've got the troops there after 18 years. I'll tell you a funny story. When we were going in there, one of the senior guys in the CIA called up his counterpart in Moscow and said, we're about to go into Afghanistan, but we don't want to start World War III with Russia, so we just want to make sure that you guys won't think this is hostile and World War III material. The Russian almost died laughing. He said, have a ball. And whatever you do, don't read up on what happened when either the British or us went in there. So I'd be a dove on that one. Generally, I'd be slow to put boots on the ground.
To bring us back to domestic policy, just last week our open classroom was on privacy and technology, and Professor Woody Herskov, one of the professors, urged us to really make this a question of civics and to ask of our lawmakers a host of questions, of which what their policy on artificial intelligence is, facial recognition, but specifically I wanted to ask you, what is your policy on antitrust regulation in relation to the tech giants? I know Elizabeth Warren has touched on this, but I'd be interested in hearing your perspective.
Yeah, I'm kind of cautious on breaking up the tech companies. I'm kind of cautious on putting the government in charge of more than it's already in charge of. I don't think we should have a law requiring Mark Zuckerberg to pass on the accuracy of political advertisements. I mean, I'm a pro, and I couldn't possibly pass on the accuracy of political advertisements. And besides, we have lots of newspapers that are willing to do so and invest a lot of resources in doing so. I was a leader along with California and Virginia, in trying to keep the government out of any supervisory role with respect to the internet whatsoever. I'm kind of anti-government in these areas, and I know it's not pretty, And you could have criminal prosecution of big tech companies who violate statutory anti-privacy laws. That's not antitrust. And I'm just not expert enough to know what little pieces of Facebook or an Amazon should be broken up into. I guess I would, there's a doctrine in tort law, in Prosser torts, called outrageous. It's a separate tort. If something is really outrageous, then it's a tort, no matter if there's no other name for it. And if they start doing stuff in the area of privacy that's outrageous, why then I'd make up a name for it and criminalize it, whether antitrust or as a matter of tort is not criminal, I guess. It could be tort civil proceedings against those companies as opposed to either criminal indictment or antitrust breakup.
Governor, I'd like to ask you about using your constitutional law experience in impeachment about the role of the Attorney General and how that plays right now. It looks like maybe there's a hole that we thought of the Attorney General as representing the people, but it looks like it's now morphed in a different direction. And how do we prevent that once we get through this kerfuffle now? What do we do about it?
Well, I spent 7 years in the Justice Department trying to keep the politics out of law enforcement, and I think I succeeded insofar as it was under me, and I resigned at the end of 7 years because I thought under Attorney General Meese, the department was becoming quite politicized, and I would go up to the fifth floor of Justice on 10th and Constitution, and there would be political groups in there sipping, well, I shouldn't criticize anyone for sipping Chardonnay, but sipping Chard with the AG and William Bradford Reynolds and the most political and Federalist Society members of the administration, and these groups had no business pending before the Justice Department. It was just a display of political access for the benefit of people who were helpful to the White House, not the Justice Department. So, Ed Meese, if little things mean a lot, he's a terrific guy. Secretary's birthdays, et cetera, very gentle guy. Did he ever begin to take off his White House hat when he came over to head the Justice Department? No, he didn't, and that's why I resigned. And I took over the U.S. Attorney's Office at a time when the Democrats have been in control for 50 years, so that will lead ineluctably to a certain degree of politicization. So we had a lot of work to do, but I gave my heart and soul to making sure that the department would live by its motto, which is to do justice without fear or favor. Recently, to my horror, Bill Barr, who used to be a good, strong guy when he was Bush 41's AG, has either taken some fatal lozenge. I know that he recently joined Opus Dei, which is a rather extreme right-wing Catholic organization. I don't know whether this has anything to do with it, but he's fallen under the Trump spell that everyone exists to serve, to watch out for the president's political skirts. It's the opposite of what the Constitution says. Bill Barr knows that. Bill Barr is very smart. But he sent this unsolicited memo to the Justice Department on June 18th of 2018, auditioning for the position of Attorney General, in which he said, no one can challenge why the president exercises a power that is granted to him under Article 2 of the Constitution. If he has the power, you can't go behind it and second-guess his motives, or he'd be defending himself in criminal court all day long, and we couldn't run a railroad or a world out there. That's simply not the case. And, it doesn't even take a third-year law student to understand that if the president pardons someone because the person paid him a $10 million bribe, that's not going to fly, okay? But under Bill Barr's scenario, it is going to fly, and he's come perilously close recently to backing up the president's theory that Congress has no right even to investigate the president. And that's totally at odds with the allocation of power under our written Constitution. And it's one reason why I feel so strongly this guy deserves to be out of there. This guy meaning the president. And Barr is giving him aid and comfort big time. The speech to the Federalist Society about how a whole bunch of murderous marauders are trying to undo the 2016 election. This is just a few days ago. It's very disappointing. And someone has also persuaded Donald Trump that he can do anything he wants under Article 2 of the Constitution. And I very much fear that it's his own Attorney General, Bill Barr, who planted that idea in his head and is nourishing it. I don't want to break new ground here, but the Attorney General is a federal officer and as such is subject to impeachment himself. But that's the only remedy. I'm sure the AG would give you an opinion he can't be indicted either.
Quickly, hopping topics here. So I've noticed recently that discussion about the LGBT community has significantly dwindled since in the 2016 election. I felt that there was a lot of discussion about gender-neutral bathrooms. We were riding this high of Obama's legalization of gay marriage, and over the past few years, and specifically this 2020 election, I've noticed there's been almost no mention of legal protection for the LGBT community, although a lot still exists there with job discrimination. And I'm wondering whether that's because there's this fear that speaking on it may alienate moderate voters or it may alienate voters within the Republican Party. So I was wondering what your take on
No,
that.
I talk about it all the time. I talk about pro-choice and LGBTQ, and on both of those I was all on my own for 20 years. And LGBTQ, I was on my own for 20 years with both parties. I mean, the Democrat governors would privately joke with me at meetings. Don't you understand? You're supposed to be all one thing and not a mix. Because I was this fiscal conservative who got prizes from the Wall Street Journal and the Cato Institute for being the biggest conservative on spending of any governor in the country. But I was way, way out front on LGBTQ issues. One of my first acts was to create a commission on teenage gay and lesbian teenage youth. We'd had a rash of suicides in this country. I backed gay marriage from the get-go. I appointed the woman, Margaret Marshall from South Africa, to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. She wrote the decision following up Loving versus Virginia, which is 1967. And she wrote the decision holding that same-sex marriage is constitutionally compelled, both under the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, and that went to the Supreme Court with the big case, the name case, and was part of the thunder and lightning that produced the 5-4 decision. Was 5-4? In the Supreme Court. So I feel like the father of gay marriage, in a way. I've certainly presided over many of them, including one between two of my cabinet members. So I'm not a shrinking violet on this issue.
We have time for a few more questions.
Maybe 2 more questions.
Thank you.
Several more.
Thank you, Governor Weld, for being here. Earlier when we touched on climate change a little bit, you said more on that later, so I'm just wondering if we could bring that up now. So I know you do recognize that climate change is a real issue, which is refreshing to see in the Republican Party. So I was looking around on your website and sort of Googling around, and I couldn't find a lot of specifics in terms of what you think is a good plan to tackle climate change, because I know you addressed that big
climate change should be on the website. I've signed off on about 10 position papers, and I wrote every word myself, by the way, of all of them. On climate change, you can't just address it with money. You have to get at the root cause, which is the increase in temperature of the Earth's atmosphere. And there's a narrow thing we have to do to prevent the polar ice cap from melting, and that's to prevent the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere from increasing more than 1.5 degrees centigrade between now and 2050. This is according to all the scientific assessment. And the way to do that is by putting a price on carbon and saying to the emitters, the polluters, that we're going to charge you $40 or $50 a ton for every ton of carbon you put into the Earth's atmosphere. And the market would respond to the pricing signal, and that there would be an equilibrium finally when the price became too painful for the coal companies, the oil companies, the mining companies, who would be the people paying this. And that would not, in my book, that would be a fee, not a tax, because it would not be kept by the government. It would be remitted to the taxpayers. And I would propose to send it back to taxpayers to lower income through the payroll tax relief for lower income taxpayers, because I am beginning to worry, partly because of Trump's divisiveness. I am worrying about income inequality, and not just as a moral matter. I'm worried about it as a prudential matter, holding society together, which I think should be our goal. But interestingly, I think I started to say this earlier, most of the Democratic plans on combating climate change just have dollar figures. They don't get into putting a price on carbon. Anyone who's not talking about that doesn't understand the issue. So, and that includes a lot of Democrats, I'm so sorry to say.
So bringing it back to the immigration issue, something that a lot of the Democratic candidates have brought up is the idea of decriminalizing border crossings, and I was wondering if you had an opinion on that.
Meaning it's impossible to commit a criminal offense by crossing the border?
Well, they want to repeal the section of the Immigration and Nationality Act that makes it a criminal offense, even though it's already a civil offense that you can get deported for.
Yeah, I would probably be disinclined to say that we need to have a totally open border so everyone can just run across it and we don't need to have a secure border at the south. Among other things, a lot of people in the country are worried about having a secure border there. But if you have more drones and more agents who can process people and detect people crossing the border, then we really don't need the wall that Trump keeps talking about. If decriminalizing would result in a great flood of people coming across the border, I worry about the optics that are playing into the hands of Trump and his folks. But I'm, a complete liberal on immigration in general, so I'd want to hear more about what the consequences of decrim would be. It might be handing Trump a sword.
What are your thoughts about people who don't show up for subpoenas, and what should be done about that?
Well, someone who's a president of the United States who says Congress can't investigate me or any people in my administration, what should be done about that is that person should be removed from the office of president. You're talking about someone in the executive branch who follows orders and doesn't show up? Well, that would depend a little bit on how senior a person that was, how close to the president, just like questions about where does executive privilege kick in. It's really close to the president, really sensitive policy maker. The president's going to have a better argument there than if it's not someone like that. But certainly, if it's not someone like that, I think people could be held in contempt and jailed. That's what we do in the grand jury system with people who don't show up. So that doesn't shock my conscience at all.
Thank you.
By the way, one of the 3 articles of impeachment voted against Nixon was obstruction of Congress for exactly that reason.
First, a quick thank you for your endorsement of putting a price on carbon. I think that is the answer, or at least one of the beginning answers for addressing climate change. My question is the observation that we have become a very polarized country, and we have people that are now firmly in their own camps. They listen to their own side. They do not have an openness, an open mind to sort of hear and understand and converse with people who don't think the way they do. What wisdom can you bring, or what approach can you bring to sort of encouraging people to talk with one another and to reunite this country?
Well, if someone asked me, what do you think are the real reasons why people should support you for president? Is it because you're so smart? Is it because you have so many friends? No. It would be because I'm comfortable in my own skin and I'm a very calm and relaxed person, and I have a demonstrated history of reaching across the aisle in political terms and getting a lot done. And that's a very strong tradition in Massachusetts ever since I proposed, coffee and cookies every Monday afternoon. Every single week since then, my successors have gone ahead with that. So I think I can look the American people in the eye and say it doesn't cost anything to reach across the aisle. Reaching across the aisle is not something that's done in Washington now in this hyper-partisan ours versus D's circus we have. So I can promise you that if I get to Washington atop the executive branch, the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. will change overnight?
Well, I think if we look back at history as any example here, incumbents get reelected. Really, I think it's, in fact, and they get renominated, right? So if you succeed in your quest, Governor, you'll be the first person since 1884, when Chester Arthur was not renominated by the GOP to unseat the incumbent president for the nomination. But that said, I think it's instructive that in 3 cases in which incumbents have gone on to lose the general election since 1976, they have faced serious challenges within their own party. And I think, as we can all see here tonight, you're very capable of doing that in 2020 on the Republican ticket. So we wish you all the best, and we thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
And I'll just add the fundamental premise of this class is that we can share academic thought with the public in general, and that we'll be candid in our conversations. And I want to thank Governor Weld for his candor and echo our best wishes as things move forward.
Let me say one more thing. I had so many commercials for Harvard Law School in there that I have to tell you, my beloved son, Quentin Roosevelt Weld, went to Northeastern Law School, and it was the making of him. And my chief of staff, Natalie Cookson, for my campaign, is a very devoted and loyal alumna of Northeastern University.
Thank you all. We are not meeting next week. We'll see you in 2 weeks.